My wife broke my heart when I saw her dancing with another man at the company party. Her laughs, her subtle touches, the way her eyes sparkled like they hadn't sparkled in a long time. My body froze. I already suspected everything. It wasn't just a dance, it wasn't just a friend. I knew. Deep down, I always knew. But seeing it with my own eyes was like feeling a blade piercing my chest. The room was lit, full of people who knew our story, our marriage. And there she was, twirling in his arms, smiling as if I had never existed. The red dress clinging to her body, her fingers sliding over that man's shoulders, the intense look she reserved only for me in the past. I walked towards them, my mind a whirlwind of hate and disbelief. My heart pounded in my throat, each beat a knife sticking into the flesh. "Is this serious?" My voice came out rough, filled with something between fury and pain. She looked at me, surprised, as if I were an intruder in my own life. "It's just a dance," he said, a half smile on his lips, trying to hide his discomfort. "He's just a friend." A friend. The same predictable, pathetic excuse that so many people use when they have no justification left. My eyes fell on the man beside her, a stranger who somehow seemed so intimate. He looked at me with an air of superiority, as if he knew something I hadn't yet discovered. As if he had already won a game I didn't even know I was playing. My blood boiled. Everything around became noise. The voices, the music, the glasses clinking in fake toasts. Nothing else mattered. Just the truth staring me in the face. She tried to explain herself, she tried to laugh, she tried to hold my hand. But I couldn't feel anything but disgust and outrage. How could someone who shared a lifetime with me look me in the eye and lie so easily? I knew it wasn't just that. It wasn't just a moment. It wasn't just one night. This betrayal didn't start there. That look, that closeness, the familiarity between them. That was something cultivated for a long time, hidden in the shadows of our house, disguised in deleted messages, empty apologies, changes in behavior that I, foolishly, ignored. I thought about the nights I spent alone while she said she was working late. In the dinners I prepared waiting for her to come home. In the cold kisses, in the hasty sex, in the lack of sparkle in her eyes when she looked at me. I wanted to believe that it was just tiredness, that it was just a phase. But the truth is that the phase was different, the phase of replacing myself. The party continued as if nothing had happened. As if my life hadn't ended there. I was surrounded by people, but I had never felt so alone. She continued to smile, moving around the room, pretending that everything was fine. As if I were crazy, as if it were wrong for me to question, for me to be suspicious. But something inside me burned. A desire to know, to destroy every lie she has built. I couldn't leave without certainty. On the way home, she talked non-stop, trying to diffuse the situation, trying to convince me that I was exaggerating. But her every word was an insult. An invisible slap. "Do you think I'm stupid?" My voice was low, but filled with something that even I couldn't name. She sighed, irritated. "I told you, nothing happened." Nothing. I could accept many things, unless they tried to make me look blind. My head was spinning, connecting all the dots I ignored out of love. The phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The repeated apologies. The messages she deleted before I could see them. The longer showers, the new perfume. And, above all, that silent distance that only exists when someone has already given themselves to another. If nothing happened, why do I feel like I lost you a long time ago? My voice was shaking, and I hated it. I hated feeling. She was silent. For the first time that night, she had no answer. The house seemed strange when we arrived. Every corner had memories of us, but now it was just an empty scenery. A stage where my life became a lie. I wanted to scream, I wanted to break everything, I wanted her to feel at least a fraction of the pain I felt. But the worst pain wasn't the discovery of betrayal. It was knowing that I still loved her, even though I knew I shouldn't. She went to sleep. I sat in the living room, with a glass in my hand, staring into space. The darkness felt more comfortable than the bed next to someone who no longer belonged to me. But I couldn't sleep. Not before you know. I took her cell phone. I've never been that kind of man, I've never needed to invade anyone's privacy. But that night, I needed proof. I needed to see the naked truth, without any more excuses or well-rehearsed lies. The screen flashed and my heart almost stopped when I saw the notification, a message from him. "Good night, my love. I hope he didn't suspect anything." The world collapsed. My breathing hitched, my body went numb. I opened the messages, swiping through conversations that crushed me with every word. Declarations of love, whispered promises, intimate details that should have been mine but belonged to someone else. She didn't just cheat on me. She changed me. And there, in that dark room, I realized that my life would never be the same. But what she didn't know was that betrayal wouldn't just end with me leaving. No. I still didn't know how, but I would make her feel every bit of the pain she caused me. What I discovered over the next few days was even worse than I imagined. She not only betrayed me, but she also threw away everything we built together. But fate has peculiar ways of settling scores. And what happened to her after that? Well, that was something even I couldn't have predicted. Welcome to the channel where the truth about betrayal is revealed without filters. Here, we do not support and never romanticize infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a strong real impact. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves marks that will never be erased. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and deep lessons. What you're about to hear will stir your emotions, and remind you that every choice has its consequences. Now, take a deep breath. The story begins. The cold night wind crossed the balcony of the apartment where Ethan and Olivia had lived for almost 7 years. The city glowed below them, lights reflecting off the windows of tall buildings, the distant sound of cars and voices blending into an urban melody that sounded familiar. Ethan stared outside, holding a half-empty glass of wine, swirling the liquid absently. He always liked this view. From the day they bought the apartment together, Olivia insisted that it was the perfect place, that they would build a solid life there, that they would feel complete there. At first, he believed. How not to believe it? The love they had seemed unshakable, made to last. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering their wedding day, the way Olivia smiled when she saw him at the altar, her eyes shining with emotion, as if at that moment nothing else existed but the two of them. Ethan was always a practical, level-headed man, someone who valued stability above all else. His work as a financial analyst required him to keep his feet on the ground, make logical and predictable decisions, and this was also reflected in his personal life. He wasn't impulsive, he didn't like surprises, he didn't believe in emotional games. When he met Olivia, he fell in love with exactly that. She brought a little chaos to his order. Her spontaneous way, the way she found beauty in small things, as if the world always had something magical hidden around every corner, enchanted and scared at the same time. In the beginning, they were inseparable. They spent hours talking about everything, laughing at inside jokes that only they understood. Every small achievement was celebrated together, every plan for the future seemed promising. Ethan remembered the first time they traveled together, a weekend at the beach that became an unforgettable memory. Olivia danced barefoot on the sand, not caring about the looks of others, and he stood there, just watching, wondering how he had been lucky enough to find someone so alive. But over time, the shine of small things faded. Not all at once, not abruptly. It was a slow, almost imperceptible wear and tear, until one day he realized that they no longer touched each other like they used to, that dinners in silence became more frequent, that the routine became a burden instead of a comfort. Olivia worked in marketing, a vibrant environment, full of extroverted people, events, campaigns. She loved what she did, and always came home full of stories about meetings, trips, difficult clients and successful campaigns. At first, Ethan listened to everything with genuine interest, admiring the passion she had for her work. But little by little, he began to feel that they were living parallel lives. He, sunk in spreadsheets and graphs, in deadlines and goals. She, in a world where creativity and emotion mixed. Still, he tried. He made an effort to keep the relationship alive, even though he often felt like he was alone in this battle. He planned trips, suggested new programs, tried to recreate moments that seemed so natural in the past. But Olivia seemed distant, distracted, as if there was always something more interesting going on outside. He didn't want to think that the problem was between them, but rather in their routine, in their adult life, in the responsibilities that inevitably took up space. He clung to the idea that every relationship goes through phases, that moments of distance are normal, that everything would return to normal if they both made an effort. But what if only one was trying? He realized that Olivia no longer looked at him the same way. Before, every detail of him seemed to enchant her. Now his eyes wandered, as if he had become just part of the furniture. He tried to justify it to himself, find logical reasons for it. The work tired her, the pressure wore her down, maybe she was going through something she didn't want to share. But deep down, something inside him screamed that it was more than that. It wasn't just tiredness. It was absence. An absence that hurt more than any fight, more than any word spoken in the heat of the moment. The company party was approaching, an event that took place every end of the year, and Olivia was excited like she hadn't been in a long time. Ethan was never a fan of these parties, but he always went for her, to accompany her, to not leave her alone. But this time, something bothered him. Her enthusiasm seemed different, the way she chose her dress, the way she spent more time than usual in front of the mirror. He noticed the details, noticed the smile when he received a message on his cell phone and didn't share the content with him. I wanted to ignore it, I wanted to believe that I was exaggerating, that my mind was just creating paranoia. On the day of the event, he watched her as she got ready. The red dress highlighted her body impeccably, her hair fell in perfect waves, and the perfume she wore, a sweet and enveloping aroma, made him remember so many nights when that smell was impregnated in the sheets. He looked at her like a man trying to memorize every detail before something was lost. She noticed his look and smiled, but it was an automatic, distant smile. "You look amazing," he said, trying to recapture something he already felt slipping away. "Thank you," she replied, grabbing her bag and checking her cell phone one more time before leaving. The party was packed, lights were flashing, laughter echoed throughout the room. Olivia was excited, talking to everyone, dancing, smiling. Ethan stayed close, but he felt like he wasn't part of that moment. It was as if he was just there as an accessory, a tolerated presence. He got a drink, tried to talk to some colleagues, but his eyes kept returning to her. Always. Because something inside him couldn't rest, because a voice insisted that something was wrong. And then he saw it. It was only an instant, but it was enough for the world to stop. Olivia, in another man's arms. The bodies too close, the way she smiled, the way she tilted her head slightly, the way his fingers rested on her waist with an uncomfortable familiarity. He felt a biting cold pass through his body, as if he were facing the final scene of a story he didn't want to believe was happening. The glass in his hand shook slightly, the sounds around him became muffled, as if everything was happening on another plane, distant, unreal. He could just turn away and pretend he didn't see it. But something inside him knew. I knew it wasn't just a dance. I knew that, from now on, nothing would be the same again. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever. Ethan was sitting on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness that took over the room. Olivia was already in the room, as if nothing had happened, as if that night was just one of many. But for him, it wasn't. Something inside him was screaming, asking him to react, not to let this go unnoticed. The image of her in the arms of that man at the party still burned in her mind. He wanted to believe that it was just a dance, that maybe he was exaggerating, that his gaze hadn't captured the whole truth. But the discomfort he felt, the cold shiver that ran down his spine, that couldn't be ignored. He knew his wife. He knew every detail of her, every expression. And what he saw that night was not something innocent. He ran his hand through his hair, taking a deep breath. I tried to find logical reasons, justify what happened. But everything seemed out of place. Olivia had been acting different for weeks. Small details that, until then, he had forced himself to ignore. The cell phone always facing down, the evasive answers when he asked about his day, the cold touch when before it was warm. He didn't want to be the kind of man who invaded his wife's privacy, who became suspicious without concrete evidence, who became paranoid. But in that moment, doubt gnawed at every part of him. The clock was almost 2 in the morning when he got up, driven by an uncontrollable restlessness. He walked to the bedroom, stopping at the half-open door. Olivia slept peacefully, as if the weight of that night hadn't affected her in the slightest. Her cell phone rested on the nightstand, the screen turned off. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. But then, as if guided by something stronger than his reason, he picked up the device and unlocked it. His heart raced in his chest, a feeling of guilt mixed with fear. He scrolled through the messages, looking for something, anything that would confirm or alleviate his suspicion. And then, he saw it. The messages were there, hidden under an irrelevant name in the contact list. Words exchanged at times he knew she would be busy, emojis, promises, declarations. Each line read made his stomach turn. His chest tightened as if the air had been knocked out of him. It was worse than he imagined. It wasn't something recent. It wasn't a passing flirtation. It was a betrayal that lasted months, maybe even longer. His hand shook as he put the cell phone back in its place. He felt a lump in his throat, an unbearable urge to scream, to wake her up, to demand answers. But something stopped him. He didn't want to act in the heat of the moment. I didn't want to explode without first understanding what was really happening. Then, he left the room, took the car keys and drove aimlessly through the city, trying to organize his thoughts. The cold wind bit his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was flooded by the words he read, by the images that wouldn't leave his head. The man Olivia was at the party with wasn't a stranger. The messages made this clear. They had history, they had encounters. They had something that Ethan never thought he needed to question. He drove for hours, until the sky began to lighten. He returned home exhausted, but without a shred of sleep. Olivia was still sleeping, oblivious to the hurricane that was forming around her. Ethan took a cold shower, trying to wash away the anger that was growing inside him, but it was no use. When he finally entered the room and lay down next to her, he felt the weight of what he discovered was an anchor holding him to the bottom of the sea. She turned over in bed, still asleep, and instinctively pressed her body against his. He felt her warmth, her familiar scent, and it was as if for a brief moment, the betrayal didn't exist. But it existed. And nothing could erase that. Over the next few days, he observed Olivia with a different gaze. Every gesture, every word, everything seemed rehearsed, fake. He tried to act normal, but inside he was falling apart. Her laughter, once so natural, now sounded like a distant echo of something that was once true. When she left for work, he would stand in the living room, staring at the door, wondering where she was really going. It was on one of those days that Ethan decided he needed more than just messages to confirm everything. I needed to be absolutely sure before I confronted her. And so, without thinking twice, he started following her. He felt pathetic, like someone who no longer had control of his life. But it was necessary. And then, he saw it. It wasn't difficult to find them. A discreet cafe, out of the way, where no one would recognize them. Olivia sat across from him, her fingers skimming the table, a look Ethan knew well. The look of someone who is surrendered. The man held her hand, and she didn't flinch. She smiled, leaned closer, and he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. There was no hesitation, no guilt on his face. Just desire, just complicity. Ethan felt a wave of nausea. His chest burned, his vision blurred. I wanted to go into that cafe, I wanted to scream, I wanted to end it right there. But he didn't do anything. He just stood there, on the other side of the street, feeling his world falling apart piece by piece. Now there was no doubt. It wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't a slip. Olivia betrayed him. And he did it without fear, without hesitation. He did it as if their love had never existed. Ethan came home before her that night. He sat on the sofa, waiting. When Olivia came in, smiling, telling him about her busy day at work, he just nodded, watching her as if seeing a stranger. She took off her shoes, went to the kitchen, opened a bottle of wine. He acted as if everything was in place. As if he were blind. Like he was an idiot. But he wasn't. And that night, he decided he wouldn't let it go. She didn't know it, but she had already lost everything. And when she found out what awaited her, it would be too late. The night was suffocating, the silence too heavy to ignore. Ethan could feel his heart hammering in his chest, a wild rhythm that he couldn't control. Olivia was there, sitting at the kitchen table, distractedly stirring her glass of wine, unaware that the floor beneath her feet was about to collapse. He watched her with an empty, distant look, but inside him a whirlwind of emotions was building up, ready to explode. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. He knew everything. The betrayal, the lies, the looks exchanged when she thought he wasn't looking. But what she didn't know was that the game had changed. And that she wasn't the only one with secrets in that house. He took a deep breath, clenching his fists under the table. Every fiber of his body screamed for him to speak, for him to throw the truth in her face, but he wanted to wait, he wanted to feel the weight of the moment, he wanted to see her reaction when the mask finally fell. Olivia noticed his intense gaze and looked up, frowning. He knew her well enough to know when she was uncomfortable, when she was trying to decipher what was going on in his head. But this time, she couldn't do it. This time, he wasn't the predictable, calm husband she was used to manipulating. The silence dragged on for long seconds before he finally opened his mouth, his voice filled with something even he couldn't name. He asked if she had anything to tell him. She blinked in surprise and let out a nervous laugh, leaning back in her chair. She said he looked strange, asked if something had happened. He didn't respond. He just kept looking, waiting, like a predator analyzing its prey. Olivia licked her lips, looked away. He said he didn't know what he was talking about. But the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. He didn't need any more proof. Ethan let out a long sigh, leaning forward, resting his arms on the table. He asked if she loved another man. The question echoed in the air, and her body tensed. He saw how her fingers tightened on the glass, how her chest rose and fell faster. Olivia laughed again, but there was no humor in the sound. He said that was ridiculous, asked if he was drunk. He just waited. The atmosphere in the house changed. What was once a home now felt like a battlefield about to be set on fire. Olivia crossed her arms, suspicious, and asked why he was acting like this. Ethan then placed his cell phone on the table and slid the device over to her. I told her to look. He said there was no more reason to pretend. She hesitated before picking up the phone. When he saw the messages, the air seemed to escape his lungs. The words exchanged with the other man were there, exposed, impossible to deny. She turned pale, her lips opened slightly, but no words came out. Ethan didn't look away. He wanted to see. I wanted to see the exact expression of panic that took over her face. She put down her cell phone and ran her hands through her hair, murmuring that he shouldn't have gone through her things, that it wasn't fair. He let out a bitter laugh. He asked if what wasn't fair was the fact that he found out or the fact that she had been cheating on him for months. Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, squeezing her eyes shut as if she were trying to control herself. Then, she let out a heavy sigh and got up, walking around the room. He said he didn't want to fight, that things between them had been bad for a long time, that it wasn't like he hadn't noticed. Ethan stood up too, without taking his eyes off her. He asked her if she even felt guilty. He asked if at any point she thought about what she was doing to him. Olivia ran her hands over her face impatiently. He said that of course he felt guilty, but that it wasn't that simple. Said she needed something he couldn't give. Ethan laughed again, but this time there was something dangerous in his expression. He asked if that was it then. If he wasn't enough, if all those years together could be thrown away because she wanted to feel something different. Olivia rolled her eyes and said it wasn't a question of throwing it away, but that things just happened. He felt anger rise in his chest. He said that betrayal doesn't happen. He said that no one wakes up one day and decides to cheat by accident. She opened her arms, exasperated. He said there was no point in arguing, that nothing she said would change what he already knew. Ethan crossed his arms, watching her. He asked if she loved him. The silence that followed was more destructive than any answer she could give. Olivia looked away, bit her lip, and then muttered that things were confusing. He felt something break inside him. But it wasn't sadness. It wasn't pain. It was something darker. Something that made him feel a bitter taste in his mouth. He approached her, smelling her scent, her presence, and then he said he knew. He knew she didn't just betray him. I knew she destroyed everything they had. But the worst of all was that she had no idea what was coming. Olivia frowned, confused. He asked what he meant by that. And that's when he revealed it. He looked her in the eyes, without blinking, and told her that she lost everything. Not just him. Not just marriage. She said that her lover already knew that everything had been discovered. And that he was gone. She said that while they were there arguing, while she was trying to justify her lies, that man she thought was worth destroying a life had already disappeared. Olivia's eyes widened, her breath hitching. He asked what he was talking about. He said it didn't make sense. But Ethan just watched her, letting the weight of the truth fall on her. She took out her cell phone and tried to call her lover's number. He called once, twice, 3 times. P.O. Box. He called again, and again, and again. Nothing. And then, the penny dropped. He was no longer there. There was nothing else. Everything she threw her life away for was gone like dust. Ethan saw her eyes fill with tears, saw the expression of despair take over her face. But he didn't feel sorry. He didn't feel anything. Because now, he was the one leaving. And Olivia? She would be alone, with nothing but the pain of knowing that she destroyed her own life with her own hands. Olivia continued to hold her cell phone in her hands, her fingers pressing on the screen as if she could force a response that would never come. The silence in the room seemed to swallow everything around it, a black hole of overwhelming emotions. Her chest rose and fell at a rapid pace, her gaze lost as she repeatedly called her lover's number, only to be ignored by the monotonous voicemail tone. Ethan watched her standing impassively, as if analyzing the remains of an inevitable disaster. There was nothing more to be said. There was nothing left to be saved. He saw the exact moment she realized she was alone, that her bet was made and that all she had left now was emptiness. She dropped her cell phone on the table, her shoulders slumping in defeat, the tears flowing silently. Ethan felt nothing but deep tiredness. A weight that didn't come from the pain of betrayal, but from the realization that Olivia was no longer the woman he loved. Maybe it never would have been. The illusion had been broken, and all that was left was a trail of lies, of wrong choices, of irreversible consequences. Olivia lifted her red eyes, searching for something in him, anything she could grab, any chance at redemption. She said she needed to explain, that he needed to listen to her, that nothing was as he imagined. But her voice sounded distant, almost an echo. He had heard enough excuses, he had read every message, seen every detail that proved otherwise. I didn't need any more lies. Ethan sighed, running his hands over his face, feeling tiredness heavy in his bones. She said there was nothing more to be said, that she didn't want to hear justifications, that no matter what she said, the truth was before them. Olivia began to cry harder, her breathing ragged with desperate sobs. He said he never wanted to hurt him, that everything got out of control, that he never imagined it would end like this. He let out a bitter laugh. He asked her if she thought betrayal was something that just happened, without intention, without decision. He asked if at any point she thought about him before sending passionate messages to another man, before meeting him, before lying next to him while Ethan was at home, believing his lies. Olivia shook her head, as if she couldn't bear to hear the truth spoken out loud. She said she felt lost, that she was looking for something that she couldn't even name, that she wanted to feel alive. Ethan was silent for a moment, processing those words, letting them echo in his mind. Then he asked if she felt alive now. She asked if it was worth it, if all that dirty play made her feel something other than what she was feeling at that moment, the bitter taste of loneliness. She didn't respond. He just lowered his head, his shoulders shaking under the weight of belated regret. Ethan felt like there was nothing left there for him. I didn't feel angry, I didn't feel a desire for revenge. I just wanted to leave. He picked up the keys from the table and started walking towards the door. Olivia's eyes widened, she took a step forward, asking him to stay, to talk, to try to fix everything. But he didn't stop. She ran to him, grabbed his arm, her voice shaking with panic. He said they could still find a way, that it was all just a mistake, that they could rebuild what they had. But he released her touch gently, as if pushing away something that no longer belonged to him. He said there were no more us. There was nothing else. Her eyes glittered with pure despair. He asked what he would do now. If he was going to simply abandon her, if he was going to forget her as if they hadn't spent so many years together. He looked at her one last time, and said that the only person who abandoned her was herself. He said she bet everything on something that never existed and lost. Then he left, closing the door behind him without looking back. The night was cold, the wind was sharp. Ethan got into the car, but didn't start the engine right away. He stood there, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the silence finally make sense. The betrayal had destroyed him inside, but in a strange way, it had also freed him. He was no longer a prisoner of a love that didn't exist, of a marriage that was just a facade. Now I had the chance to start over. Olivia, on the other hand, was left behind, alone in an apartment that suddenly seemed too big, too empty. He picked up his cell phone once again, dialed his lover's number as if he could still change something, but he knew he wouldn't answer. He had already moved on. She was just a mistake he had already gotten rid of. And for the first time, Olivia felt the weight of her choices, not as a woman who lived a forbidden passion, but as someone who destroyed everything without even realizing she was sinking. And now, there was nothing left. Ethan drove aimlessly for a long time, his mind still processing everything that happened. But then, something inside him began to change. The emptiness gave way to a strange relief, a certainty that his future was now his alone. There were no more doubts, no more fear. Because sometimes the worst thing that can happen is also the best thing that could have happened. Ethan drove aimlessly for hours. The silence inside the car was as thick as what he had left behind. The streets passed before him in a blur of light and shadow, but his mind was far from there. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't stay. The apartment where he spent years building a life was now no longer his home. It was nothing more than a scenario of lies and betrayal. Every corner of that place was tainted with memories that now seemed false, memories that had lost any meaning. He wondered if Olivia was still there, if she was still holding the phone in the futile hope that her lover would answer, if she finally understood that everything she had done had led her exactly to where she was now, alone. The thought brought him no pleasure. He felt no joy, no revenge, just a sense of absolute exhaustion. As if all the weight of the years with her had finally lifted off his shoulders. But even though he didn't want to admit it, a part of him still tried to understand. When did everything start to fall apart? When did Olivia stop being his wife and become a stranger? He wanted to believe that there was an exact moment, an instant where everything changed, but the truth was crueler, there wasn't a moment. It was a slow, invisible wear and tear, until, when he realized it, he was already walking on ruins. He parked the car in front of a random hotel. I didn't want to go home, I didn't want to sleep in the car like someone who lost everything, even if, in a way, I had. At reception, he asked for a room without paying attention to the receptionist who spoke mechanically about breakfast times and magnetic keys. He just nodded and went up to his room, throwing the suitcase he had quickly picked up before leaving the house on the bed. He took a long shower, trying to wash away not only the tiredness of the day, but the weight of the past. The water ran down his body, but nothing seemed to ease the knot in his chest. After leaving the bathroom, he took out his cell phone and stared at the screen for long seconds. He thought about sending a message to a friend, telling them what happened, asking for advice. But what could anyone say? That he should move on. That he deserved better. That Olivia wasn't worth it. None of these sentences would change how he felt at that moment. And he didn't want to hear anything. Not yet. He threw himself on the bed, looking at the ceiling. Sleep did not come immediately. He stayed there, remembering everything he had experienced with Olivia, trying to find signs that he hadn't noticed before. But the past was now unchangeable. So, he took out his cell phone and opened a messaging app. His hands hovered over the screen before typing a name he hadn't seen in a while. The message was short. He just asked if they could meet. The answer came a few minutes later. Ethan left the hotel without thinking much. He needed air, he needed to see someone who wasn't connected to the pain he carried. I needed a break from that internal storm. He walked to a small bar away from the center, a quiet, discreet place where no one would recognize him. When he entered, he saw the woman sitting in one of the corners, waiting for him. She smiled when she saw him, but her look soon became worried. He asked if he was okay. He laughed, humorlessly. I said no. She invited him to sit down. He ordered a drink for him, as if he already knew he wasn't just there to talk. Ethan took the glass, swirled the liquid inside it, taking his time to speak. But I knew that at some point I would need to say it out loud. I would need to tell the truth. Then he finally told. About Olivia, about what she saw, about what she discovered, about how she left the house without looking back. The woman listened attentively, without interrupting him, just letting him speak at his own pace. When he finished, there was a dense silence between the two. She sighed, shaking her head. He said he was sorry, that he could imagine how much it must have hurt. Ethan looked at her for a long time. He asked her if she thought he should have seen it sooner. If he was blind. She smiled slightly. I said no, that sometimes love does that. It makes people ignore signs, choosing to believe the best, because the alternative is too painful. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He said he didn't know what to do now. She held his hand on the table, squeezing lightly. Said he didn't need to know. That maybe, for the first time in a long time, he might just not have a plan. And for the first time, that idea didn't seem so scary. They stayed there for a few more hours, talking about things that didn't involve pain, that didn't involve betrayal. And Ethan realized it had been a long time since he felt like this. As they left the bar, he looked at her, at the way the wind ruffled her hair, at the way her smile seemed genuine. She asked if he wanted to take a walk before going back to the hotel. And for the first time since everything fell apart, Ethan said yes. The following days passed in a blur, but not with suffering. Ethan no longer felt that crushing tightness in his chest. He felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Olivia's betrayal no longer occupied his every thought, it was no longer the center of his existence. He didn't look back anymore. He was a free man, and that freedom didn't have a bitter taste, but rather a lightness that he hadn't experienced in years. He had moved to a new apartment, far from anything that might remind him of the past. Little by little, he began to rebuild his life, rediscovering simple pleasures that had previously been buried by the routine of a failed marriage. He walked more around the city, exploring places that had always been there, but that he had never noticed. I would go out to dinner alone, without feeling like anything was missing. And eventually, he started seeing the woman he talked to that night at the bar more often. It was a meeting without expectations, without pressure, just the company of someone who made him laugh, who didn't demand ready answers, who understood his silence without needing to fill it with empty words. Meanwhile, Olivia experienced the opposite. The apartment, once cozy, now seemed like a cold, empty, suffocating space. The nights were too long, and every sound echoed through the hallway uncomfortably. She tried to follow the routine, pretend she was fine, but the truth was unbearable, she wasn't. There were no more messages on the cell phone, there were no more expectations for the following days. Her lover had disappeared without even looking back, without caring to know what had happened to her. There was nothing more pathetic than realizing that everything he did meant absolutely nothing to him. The silence inside the house was deafening, and for the first time, she missed Ethan. Not from the betrayed, hurt Ethan, but from the man who was always there to catch her when she stumbled. From the man who, for years, believed in her, protected her, loved her. Only then did she realize that he was never the one who wasn't enough. It was her. It was his own inability to feel complete with what he already had, his constant dissatisfaction, his desperate search for something he never knew how to name. Now, it was too late to realize this. One night, after yet another failed attempt to find a reason to leave the house, she took out her cell phone and typed a message. The words seemed too small to express what he felt, but he sent them anyway. Ethan saw her name on the screen and felt nothing but curiosity. When he opened the message, he found a simple request, if they could meet to talk. He stared at the words for a while, but didn't feel like responding. Their story was over. There was nothing more to be said. The next morning, Olivia woke up and saw that he was unresponsive. He tried to convince her that he already expected this, that he already knew he didn't want anything to do with her anymore. But when she faced her reflection in the mirror, she realized what was really happening, she was becoming the emptiest version of herself. The price of betrayal wasn't just losing Ethan. It was losing everything she thought she had. Time passed, and Ethan moved on with his life. He met new people, explored new places, created new stories. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't need answers to the past, he no longer needed to understand what led Olivia to betray him. The past no longer mattered. All that mattered was what came next. And unlike her, he had an after. Now I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Comment below. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now for more impactful stories like this. And remember, here, we do not support cheating. Every choice has a consequence. See you next time.